Hey folks, I'm Layman Pascal, and I was just out on the deck trying to figure out, trying to sand the deck, honestly, and then trying to figure out whether the personal construction of reality or the social construction of reality comes first or second. Are they related more like stages or more like epistemic and typological alternatives? And that's when I realized we're all going to die. And so is the earth, and many of our old forms of collective meaning making are already dead, and radical future changes have already been unleashed in ways that cannot be stopped. Plus, your heart's going to be broken again, definitely. And to be honest, our world is so complex, even the best map is oversimplified and misleading. And anyone who wants to sell you a shiny new worldview that fixes your problems is probably not allowing themselves to feel what Gurdjieff called the terror of the situation. It's tragic. But on the other hand, here we are, still alive, capable of love and joy and effort, and able to participate in the cultivation of a more healthy, sane, and strong world, nourished by developmental and multi epistemic principles. And who knows, maybe our participation in all of that is effective only to the degree that we emotionally accept mortality and finitude and confusion and error and the death of all inspiring visions. So I came inside to do a discussion about post tragic attitudes and the art of painting. That's right. You're listening to Integral Stage Second Tier, where we pair the main serious topic with a more casual second topic. So, here to cheer me up about bumming me out about the doom of the world and to talk about painting is friend of the show and friend of mine, Alexander Love. Hey, man.
Hey, Layman, really happy to be here. It's such a joy.
I don't know what your home living environment is like, but are there paintings on the walls? I see you've got
Oh,
one right there.
indeed, there are paintings on the walls. My wife is a painter. My uncle, who is no longer alive, he was a painter for, he said in his 90s that after 50 years, he finally learned how to paint. So, yes, there are many paintings in my life and also on walls in my house.
Which one is your favorite?
Um, which one is my favorite? Well, I'm looking at one right now where there's an image of uh, um, a solemn, darkened shadow of a man with a cane who's drifting through a brightly colored nightscape. And so that's one of my favorites. Yeah, one of my favorites.
So the post-tragic sensibility, philosophically, we could argue it's been around for a long time as sort of an attitude, but it was languaged in a particular way by the Consilience Project folks who spoke about pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic orientations. And since then, it's been popping up in developmental communities for a while because it's resonating with something that a lot of people are experiencing or that they feel is left out by other formulations. What does the concept of the post tragic mean to you, and why do you think it's resonating with people?
Well, firstly, I think it's resonating with people because the name itself, uh, it has a sting to it. There's something about the recognition that we do experience tragedy, we do experience horror, we do experience agony, and there's an invitation to, on the one hand, embrace that, but on the other hand, acknowledge it, maybe from a new position. So for me, post-tragic worldview, before anything else, it's rooted in wholeness. And what I mean by that is it's rooted in a place of being where even tragedy, difficulty, hell is somehow recognized, not conceptually, but in a direct experiential way, is recognized as a feature of one gesture.
Yeah, I think it's related to the awareness of other concepts like spiritual bypassing and things like this that have come up in developmental communities over the last few decades. A sensitivity to toxic positivity and oversimplification. I just did this Integral Theory for Idiots course, of which you get a lot of perverse shout outs in the fourth episode. But in the gatherings, the social sessions, the campfires outside of the recorded course, a lot of everyone's concerns were around death and dementia and nightmares and political difficulties that are going on in certain countries. And it seems on the face of it, when you talk about developmentalism, there's this tendency to have a real overly tidy idea. Like even you're like, oh, states and stages are different. Okay, but once I get my best stages locked down, then I'm good, right? Well, only sort of when you're in your best situation, and your best situation is going to be compromised repeatedly. You're going to stub your toe and your loved ones are going to die and you're going to have a bad day, and that shit never goes away no matter what state you master or how far you progress in some kind of stage complexification sense. So I feel like there's a hunger for this discussion that's been building for decades, and people are just starting to get the language for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, there's a couple things in there. One, to me, a post-tragic worldview does not imply a later stage capacity. There are a long history of human beings that we might, from a developmental perspective, place at an earlier developmental wave that has a post-tragic perspective. So for me, a post-tragic worldview has a lot to do with the depth of our experience rather than the height. Now, of course, there are certain features that get foregrounded when we see both, when we see depth and height together. Now, the other thing I wanted to say here is that, there is an ongoing concern for spiritual bypassing. And to me, that's more included in the pre-tragic worldview, that there's a way in which we can either be bumbling around the world in innocence, which in a child is healthy. For a child to be shown a good world while they're forming their foundation, there's some developmental wellness in that. But then as we move into adulthood, I think that there's uh, different ways that a pre-tragic worldview can show up. One is in spiritual bypassing. Another is in the notion of something like fake news, where I just dismiss tragedy as something that doesn't exist. Um, Spiritual bypassing is doing the same thing, it's just wearing different clothing. And so I think that if we can understand that that's what comes up in a pre tragic domain, then it helps us differentiate that a post tragic domain is coming on the other side of tragedy. That also means that we are on the other side of feeling tragedy, that it's broken our hearts open. And so we're coming to a way of orienting that can't dismiss it. As a part of this, I also want to mention that's something that Tucker Walsh was pointing out also, is that these things don't exist like, oh, that person just has a pre-tragic worldview and this person just has a post-tragic worldview. Just like developmental stages, through the course of one day, we can, watch a TV show and go into a pre-tragic bliss state and then have stub our toe and experience a tragic, agony, and then have a good conversation with a friend and come to a post-tragic perspective in relationship to all of it.
I remember watching Bo Burnham's show Inside for the first time. I was sitting on the couch with my partner, and he sings this song, That Funny Feeling, which is already like an invitation to my subtle little sensors to track something interesting. There's a line in that song where he goes, 20,000 years of this, seven more to go. And it just crushed me. I was just weeping on the couch. But it was beautiful because it was simultaneously apocalyptic and cathartic. It renewed me to be a regenerative participant, and it relieved me of the pressure of thinking I could outrun tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah, we certainly cannot outrun it. And bypassing doesn't work very well long term either. And so, what's been real for me is the willingness to go into the tragedy of one's own experience intimately enough that something begins to emerge, a kind of aliveness, a deep intrinsic positivity, which is different than um, having a positive viewpoint. I mean, it might be a feeling of deep terror, it might be a feeling of agonizing grief, but through the intimacy with that experience, getting even closer than the agony, I find there's that one gesture that's discoverable in that, but it has to come through leaning into it.
A lot of my thinking, and I'll come back to this later in the discussion, a lot of my thinking on this comes through Nietzsche and the notion of the Dionysian affirmation of the tragic condition. And one of my like early insights into how to start reading Nietzsche differently when I was a kid came through the realization that, oh, this is the blues. Nietzsche's talking about the blues. He's talking about not an idealistic avoidance of despair and destruction and failure. He's talking about the radical transfiguration of that condition based on an embrace of it and its feeling qualities in the living being.
Yes. Well, and this brings us back to the other discussion of art. To me, this is the essence of good art, which is to take something grotesque or take something that society moves away from or doesn't pay close attention to and brings out the beauty in it. You know, my wife Veronica, she paints many different styles, but she has gone through many moments where she was painting elderly people. And not only is she painting them, but I also see the art that she's looking at. And we have different various artists that are, looking at bodies that are not in this modern era considered bodies we should want to look at and drawing out the beauty in those shapes. And to me, the blues and an extension of that, jazz, is a perfect example of a post-tragic view in action. Whether the creators were conscious of it or not, we can look at it as a movement of taking incredible hardship and pain and orienting to specific circumstances that placed certain people together that created this art form known as jazz, which brings blues and it also brings the virtuosity of classical music and creates its own new form. And so, um, exactly, finding beauty in the dark.
Just going to do for anyone listening, full shout out to Veronica's art because the examples that I've seen have a very liminal quality. Like they do what I want art to do for me, which is sort of equally distribute my attention in a number of different places very subtly so that I get a very strange experiential effect when I'm looking at it. That's kind of what I want art to do for me. When I was a kid, I had my dad had a great set of like Time Life books about artists, and I would read them. Picasso seemed awesome, and Leonardo da Vinci seemed like a weird, and mutant historical strange thing. But it was when I came across Salvador Dali as a kid that I first like fell in love with an artist, and then subsequently the whole surrealist movement and their attempt to bring the subconscious into the conscious and create these hybrids. Um, was there a first favorite painter for you? Was there ever a moment where you like fell in love with a painter or a style of painting or something?
Yeah, I think it was Juan Miro, and
Mm.
it has some of that wild surrealist kind of. I don't know the right words. I'll call it shapeism. It's probably not what it's actually called, but these wild shapes and colors. I grew up in New Jersey, right near Philadelphia, and so going to the Philadelphia Art Museum was a, a regular thing that I would do. And um, Juan Miro had some pieces, at least one piece there that I was struck by because for me I grew up dyslexic and so back then it wasn't very as clear as to what that meant. People just kind of said, oh, you have a hard time reading, but really I had a different way of knowing. I wouldn't remember a street sign, but I remember the feel of the corner. And there was something about art that spoke to me in a way that didn't look like a spreadsheet. And I usually just want to cry when I see a spreadsheet. And so these kind of surrealist artists have a way of capturing beauty um, in a non-linear way that always helped me feel like I was sane.
Yeah, I love Miro, one of the great Spanish surrealists, and there's kind of it was always like I was looking at the organic circuitry in the basement of reality.
Uh, yes. Yeah.
um, you and I were at this meeting a little while ago for Icon 2026, and you proposed, and we'd had actually a discussion the previous day about the post-tragic to some degree.
Right.
And a lot of people were like, yeah, yes, exactly. But a
Mhm.
few people were like, well, I don't know. It's not like we're already in the post-tragic condition. I think we're still dealing with tragedy. And I was trying to say things like, well, maybe what we mean is something more like the trans tragic, but we're going to call it the post tragic because it sounds better. But what's your sense of, and maybe even surprised by, people's misunderstandings of the post tragic? Like, where have you been a little bit caught off guard by what other people think it might mean?
Well, firstly is the idea that it might mean we're spiritually bypassing something. That how could we in this era possibly look at what's going on and recognize that there's some intrinsic positivity in the structure of the cosmos without spiritually bypassing. So that's been the main thing that I've been surprised by. Um, and also, I think partially why we're having this conversation in the first place is that maybe it's not as well known as a word as I thought it was. And so it's an opportunity for us to open a conversation in the community to explore, like, what is this? And part of it can be a co-creation. It's not something that's already concretized. It's something that we can explore together. And the other thing is that sometimes I hear it being spoken about as an ontology that's out there that I can then decide whether I'm a part of or that it's here or not here. The post-tragic worldview is awakening to something within reality. It's not something that we are tripping over. So it's not like, oh, tragedy has to be over in order for there to be a post-tragic possibility. In fact, I think a post-tragic worldview is an answer to some of the loss of heart that occurs when the tragic worldview within each of us opens, which can also often come with a sense of there's too much pain out there for me to do anything about it. It's too big. How am I going to stop all of these forces that seem like dark forces that are causing so much harm to so many people? And the thing is, as each of these worldviews brings their gifts, but they also have a place at which they hit a ceiling. And I think the post-tragic worldview has a way that it can offer that experience of recognition of tragedy in us, that we don't have to lose heart, actually. And that doesn't mean that things are going to go well. It doesn't mean that there's some like, distant human heaven on earth that we're going to like make sure happens no matter what. The whole thing might crash and burn, but there's a place from which we can orient to that, where it's still glistening with the aliveness of the evolutionary impulse, deep intrinsic positivity.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of superficial way to read evolutionary spirituality, which is like, oh, great, the universe wants to go in this wonderful direction. We're participants, but really we don't have to worry very much because it's going the right way, and we have faith then, and we can create a new narrative and sell that narrative to others. But all of those stories, assuming they have any reality in the cosmos at all, are very long term arcs, right?
Yep.
Even if the cosmos is going in a generally benign direction for some very interesting reasons, that doesn't mean the next 1,000 years isn't going to be hell on earth.
That's right.
And I think a lot of people, the way people are holding the political situation over the last say 10 years or something, has brought a lot of people to the realization that they might have been a little bit naive in their assumptions about progress and the arc of history. Do you have a
Yeah.
sense that the social condition of the world is making people ripe for a post-tragic vision?
Yes, because it's exactly what you're talking about, right? There's a way in which I can be an innocence or naivete around, oh, evolution's great, like 14 billion years, yay, like look how great it is. And I think that what you're inviting is that the the reality of the current political climate, really the reality of how we've been hurting each other despite the current political climate. It's just now there's certain things that are on the news that are amplified, but we've been doing a lot of harm, quite a lot for quite a long time. It's a way that it doesn't let us move that far away from the fire to really examine who am I, what am I doing here, and what am I going to do about it? And does that matter? And I think that uh, being held that closely to the fire starts to bring up questions around, can I do it from here? Can I do it from a place of hopelessness? Can I do it from a place of emotional overwhelm where I'm feeling everything? You know, we have the rise of postmodernism, and the with that comes the rise of this very sensitive self that's able to feel everything and feel all these subtle energetic empathy experiences. Is that sufficient? That deep sensitivity, that deep feeling, is that sufficient to be able to lean in and say, oh, yeah, I've got a backbone and I'm going to give everything to loving this world as deeply as possible? And so I think that it does. I think that the current climate amplifies the tragedy in the world, giving us an opportunity to see if that's if where we're coming from is sufficient, or if we need to find a deeper a deeper possibility.
Monet or Manet? Who's the best?
Well, you know, I love Monet. I love some of those, which is interesting because I tend to be a little bit uncomfortable with. Um, uh, there's an element of shadow within me that tends to be more uncomfortable with muddiness and indistinction. But somehow Monet, the I guess I call it the fragrance of the strokes, allows for a kind of fuzzy edged boundarylessness that from a little further away uh, becomes a deep presence of being that somehow helps me lean in a little closer to the ambiguous, fuzzyless edges that I am still learning how to be close with.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, I mean, there's an invitation to beauty and an invitation to fuzziness and an invitation to the balance between presence and absence in Monet.
Yeah.
But I read a great book called The Judgment of Paris. It was about Meissonier and Manet. And Meissonier was the greatest painter in France, but when it was still in the classical era and it was judged at the official salon, and he painted super realistic horses, and everybody thought he was the guy. And then Manet, who did not intend to change art, and this is something I'm really fond of, is this gap between how seldom people who want to change the paradigm, and how often it's changed by somebody who did not want to change the paradigm. Because Manet thought he was just a totally normal dude doing totally normal painting, and he couldn't understand why everyone hated it and all the young guys liked it. And it's really weird. Like if you watch even the luncheon on the grass picture, it's like every little section of it seems to be from a slightly different perspective, like you're looking through fly's eyes or something. And I just love this idea of this just weird dude doing his own thing, creating a revolution, and all the young guys could be like, "This is the thing," but he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about. I just do it like this. I'm a pretty normal guy."
Yeah.
The perversity of that enchants me.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you know, pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic are sort of available all the time. It's not really dependent on your historical period or your stage of development. But there's something of interest to me in terms of the role that the post-tragic might play in people's emotional maturation in what we would call the second tier or some of these higher stage categories. Because when you get into a big picture or a big picture community and you're like, oh my god, it fits together, this is great, we're going to pull this off, we just need to tell everybody. And then you deal with people who've been doing it for a while, a little more mature, a little more grounded. You hang out with them in private and very often they'll be like, I don't know if I even care about any of this, are we changing anything, I don't even know if I want to. They continue to do it,
Yeah.
but they've sort of let something about their idealism die.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see a kind of, there's many, as if we were like yellow, teal, and turquoise, or whatever we want to do in speculative, advanced levels, there are cognitive elements to that.
Mhm.
But as an emotional element, is the awakening to the pre tragic something you think sort of characterizes a teal to turquoise shift, or whatever language we want to use for that?
Well, I think that what I notice, the way that I hold it, is looking at the altitude axis and then the depth dimension. And the way that I understand it, and I know that people sort of like to argue about this and have a whole debate about it, which is fantastic. The way that the way that it makes sense to me is that as we grow up, there is the potentiality for key potentiality for growing deep. It doesn't mean that we will. It just means that if we're looking at it's like in Chinese medicine, in order to learn how to diagnose via the pulse, the first thing you have to do is learn what is a perfectly healthy pulse, which no person really has. But there has to be some baseline from which you're measuring all of the peculiarities and differences. So, with that image in mind, um, to me, if we're looking at healthy developmental wellness, there is a movement from growing up and growing deep together. For instance, a newborn, which would be at one of the earliest stages, it tends to know the world through concrete sensing, right? It's sensing with the surface. It's more on the surface. When you when you go a little bit later, now the person is able to use, concrete reasoning. It's a little bit deeper. And so when we get up into these later waves of development, my sense is that that potentiality for having easier access and greater access to depth is higher. With that said, not everybody does that. And so I've seen many people that are you might say, the turquoise altitude, who are radically positive with a complete willingness to be in a place of intimacy with deep pain. So that positivity is coming through the dark nights. But I've also met folks who would show up at, let's say a turquoise altitude that have an incredible, uh, mind-bending capacity for complexity, but they still can't tell when a 5-year-old part of the self is taking them over and obscuring their identity. Now, they can see 45 million parts in relationship to a bunch of other constructs and weave it all together in a transdisciplinary meta model thing. But then when it comes to being in relationship with a person, a 12-year-old takes them over and they don't know it. And they're not able to easily differentiate between this deeper place of wholeness and a shadow dimension of the self that's taking over their eye space. And so I think that there's the potential for this, but it requires some cleaning up work, some clarification work in order for those things to occur in a healthy way.
So something like the post tragic is involved in the potential for going deep at any stage of development. More elaborate stages might give you more tools for depth finding. One of the questions that comes up for me is sort of when you think about it, wherever you happen to be in this uh, semi-plausible stage model of the universe that a lot of people are congregating around, is there more or less unlimited depth potential at that level? Or is the depth potential at that level dependent upon the depth that was achieved at prior levels?
Well, it's a really
Can
good
I go
question.
real? Can I go really deep at level 6 if I was really shallow, levels 1 through 5, or does it build on the amount of depth achieved at previous layers of the stack?
I think that there is an unrelenting magnetic allure from our deepest nature. And the only thing that is keeping us from that are the various burdens, or you might call it, um, uh, karmic structures, the consequences of the way that we've stumbled through the world. It weighs on our being in such a way that that magnetic allure is tugging at us to discover our deeper nature. And then there are things that get in the way of that, like if like a silk cloth was on a bramble patch and someone's pulling on that silk cloth saying, I want to bring you back to your deep gesture of being and becoming. There's all these snags and places of agony. Now, um, so with that said, I think we could come up with a logical way of looking at it and say, well, yes, the degree to which we've experienced depth here is going to impact the degree of depth we experience when we grow up. At the same time, we never know when all of the interactions that we're having that maybe, especially if we bring a post-tragic perspective to it, that may be unhooking some of that silk and cloth. We never know the moment when that tug happens that it's stronger than the structures of our heavy history. And then we come to know more deeply who we are. So I think we can look at it linearly. It'll make a nice map. And then I also think that there's a deep desire that may overcome any structures we come up with around trying to understand it.
Race may be involved, listeners. Um, who's a painter you didn't initially like but have come to appreciate with time?
I think it would be Rothko. I always appreciated um, like they were nice colors, you know? And so it's not like I felt distaste, but I think it's something that, my aunt, she's still alive, she's 94. She's had a whole life of she's a sculptor and the photographer and all sorts of things. You guys can look her up, Arlene Love. She's fantastic. My uncle was a painter who did he had so many phases. Veronica is a painter. And so there's a bit of a snobbery in me when it comes to what is good art. Um, I've been I've been taught through transmission, not through direct language, but through transmission to be snobby about the art that I see. And so there's a way in which, like, if I go into the museum and I see a like a broom snapped in half and hung from the ceiling, I scoff that would make it into the museum and Veronica's art wouldn't. Now, Rothko, I don't put in that category, but I think upon first glance, it's like, oh yeah, nice colors on a thing. But then as I've taken the time to receive that color transmission more deeply, um, I've come to appreciate more that there's something, I don't know what to call it, enchanting, mystical. I don't have quite the word because there's something ineffable. That's probably the word. Something ineffable about how he's transmitting color that's different than if I just said like, oh, look, bright yellow and bright red and like put it on a canvas. It somehow wouldn't convey what those are conveying.
Yeah, I've had a lot of mixed feelings about evaluating more contemporary abstract pieces because sometimes they seem to go in a sort of very flat conceptual direction, but sometimes I haven't been able to tell that apart from people who were really experimenting with the primary ratios of sensory experience to find it in its pure form. I went with my dad one time to Vancouver to a exhibit of Rodin's sculptures, fantastic exhibit. But upstairs, there was an exhibit of art from the university. And it was, a vacuum cleaner in an empty room with an American flag and this stuff. You go through and you're like, oh, compared to Rodin, this is giving me a completely different feeling. And at first, I thought it was a failure. But then I realized later, I'm like, oh, they're asking a different question. This is a very conceptual question. Everybody here is asking the question, what is art? But
Yeah.
the great artists were not asking that question. A Rodin sculpture doesn't make you go, what is art? Maybe anything could be art. It makes you go, what the fuck is this?
That's right.
It's monumental and ponderous.
That's right. Absolutely. It reminds me of, you're speaking of sculpture and figure, and there's a way in which that a good artist is able to capture the invisible in form. And you're absolutely right. When someone is putting an American flag and a vacuum cleaner next to each other, it's a different, it's trying to provoke, it's art in that it's trying to provoke something, and it's something that we can witness. But it's different in terms of how, Veronica is able to paint a face, and somehow I'm like looking and I can see that it's just strokes of paint, but somehow she's captured this enchanted world in a way that it smacks me in the face. And that produces awe, which I would say is a feature of the post-tragic worldview. And I might be looking at something that is typically considered ugly or grotesque or not sexy. And yet it's showing me it's bringing me into a place of awe, into this deep sacredness that's um, in the fabric of things.
Yeah, that reminds me of what do they call it in Japan? Wabi sabi, the kind of art of the decay and dysregulation. My parents like to take pictures, black and white photos of barns that are half crumbled when I was a kid. There's
Yeah,
something about that. You're like, look at the joy in the ruin. But
that's
it's
right.
legitimate joy. It's very clear, it's very clean, it's very pure, but it is able to work with what seems to be collapse of structure.
Yeah, it reminds me of my aunt. She's lived a life. Uh, she's lived the life of an artist that has a very deep relationship to darkness. And walking through her house, you see all sorts of examples of my uncle's paintings are all these beautiful, bright landscapes, and then you'll see, my aunt will have a sculpture of, three short, maybe 2 feet tall women who are in leather bondage, and so growing up in this house, I used to go there almost once a week. Growing up in this house was this vast discovery of the sort of the colorful and the dark. I remember there was at the top of there was this stairwell, and along the stairwell was probably about 50 Mexican masks. They're, these sun gods made from like the pelvis of an animal. And then at the top, there was this 12, maybe 10 to 12 foot tall statue of this guy tied, his arms are tied together, and he's got arrows pointing through him. And then I would uncover books like I, this has got a trigger warning. Whitkin is this guy. He takes photographs of installations of like deceased people. It's really, really dark. There's no attempt to make it beautiful, except for the fact that it's art. And so, as you were speaking, it just reminds me of growing up in this, visiting this home that was like There's so much diversity of color and horror all in one, all in one.
Post tragic, it seems to me, has this ability to bring together the more and less fortunate elements of the world, right? Because for lots, unimaginably large numbers of people are suffering unimaginable things all the time and right now. And that has to be acknowledged and recognized and brought into what we're working on.
Yeah.
And yet, people who have fairly fortunate lives have to be able to connect to that. And they connect to that some ways through um, a kind of immunity or dissociation or reversal of what they're embedded in. And I think about these stories like when everyone had to work outside, it looked really sexy to have pale skin. But then when everyone worked at the office, it looked sexy to have a tan. It said you could go on vacation. That these turnovers happen historically because I know there's so much technology and art in airbrushing and the Instagram world of let's look good. But when I hang out with kids and they're using Snapchat, they're using filters to make themselves look gross and ridiculous and ugly and deformed and non-symmetrical. And I'm
Mm.
asking myself whether they're becoming immune to something about the positivistic marketing culture, to something about the ease of vain self presentation and self marketing. And that sort of reversal of what they've been put in starts to give them a taste of the beauty of the dark, which can connect them more empathically, I think, to people who are just embedded in suffering.
Yeah. Well, I think we find this in music too. We find this in all art forms, like the phrase, I forget who said it, you might know, but um, this notion of writing something that's just positive is like, white letters on a white page, or if we hear music that doesn't have tension in it. There's something about it that just, we live in a world of duality. And if we don't feel that duality, there's some way in which we feel disconnected from who we are here as humans. Um, and so I think that there's a desire and a need for us to be able to feel the reality of this world's agony in order to also be able to experience a deeper sense of coming home. And I think the post-tragic perspective is precisely that. There's a recognition there, not conceptually. There's a recognition that everything is sacred, but with this capacity to hold the polarities of, well, everything is sacred, and yet that thing that's happening is awful. And this is, I think, back to an earlier question. I think it's really important that when we're talking about the post-tragic worldview, it cannot function as a set of conceptual ideas. It's a depth dimension. We can use conceptual ideas to describe it, but if we don't really get close to the horror and feel the sacredness in it, then we're not talking about the same thing. We're going to say, "Oh yeah, everything is positive over there that I'm not going to get close to." And it's not that it's positive that someone's child just died. It reminds me of we ran into an acquaintance the other day, incredible human being. This woman has been uh, she was married for about 60 years, and was telling us about the last year of her husband's life. He had just died, a couple weeks ago. This is a woman who has one of the deepest people that I've ever met. She doesn't know the words post-tragic. She's not using the same language. And to listen to her describe her experience with her husband, you could feel the sense of heartbreak. He wasn't able to move at the end for quite a while, could hardly talk. He couldn't tell where he was in space. You could feel in a way, the heaviness that was, the way in which the heaviness was living within her. But you could also hear with every word how precious every moment was to her. This wasn't some idea that she learned at a workshop that she's like putting on top of an experience. She was living the exhaustion of having been helping her husband for a year along with hospice. She's living the exhaustion, and she was talking about she would read him these stories. And then she would go off into telling us about one of the stories. And you could feel the symbolism that she was touching as she was telling the stories, and how she, would take him outside to have one last look at a beautiful expression of life. And then you could feel the sorrow, and you could feel the deep joy. And to me, it was like the best expression of a post-tragic worldview coming from someone who doesn't have that language, that it can't be a set of ideas. It has to be much, much more than that.
I think one of the ways it gets languaged in a less philosophical way is when people talk about soul, like not as a metaphysical capacity, but as that thing that an older person who's really lived a fucking life has.
Yeah.
Actually, when you were saying that, I got this image of two forms of mapping. We were talking about like growth and depth and stuff, but well, there's the land that you take an airplane and you can take a photograph, you get a good map of the land from the air. But then there's a boat on the water and it's like dragging something along the bottom of the ocean, getting the texture mapping of that reality. And I feel like for a lot of people, in a very basic way, that's what it means to have soul, right? To have real skin in the game of existence in this world.
Yes, skin in the game of existence in this world. Absolutely. And that's, to me, it's all about intimacy. Intimacy with the pain. That's what I was speaking to before. It's like getting so close to the texture that you feel that it's one gesture. It's like you get so close to the thing that that tugboat is dragging that you feel that the wetness of the ocean is inside of whatever it is that it's dragging. But you could surmise that from reading a book from the sky, but it's different when you touch it and you say, "Oh my, this deep-seated grief and pain of separation is that very essence of love that's alluring me to the depths of the ocean." They're not separate. They're the same taste.
There's a conversation around post traumatic growth, right? And the possibility that sometimes what seems catastrophic is a springboard for a being to increase its um, power, its capacity. That actually, in the anti fragile sense, a lot of things in nature flourish because they're able to respond or even over respond to trauma with a kind of flourishing. But it's not, therefore, the case that you help people by traumatizing them,
No.
because not everybody can achieve post traumatic growth for personal reasons, biological reasons, circumstantial reasons. So when it comes to the post tragic, is it a do you feel like it's an important sort of vision and sensibility for everyone or for certain kinds of people that are ready for it?
I think it depends on how it's languaged. If it's languaged in a particular way, then it'll sound like it's just for a certain, set of human beings. So we could language the post-tragic worldview in the context of development and integral theory. And if we did it that way, then it could easily sound like, oh, this is only for people that are ready for it, or people that are, in this particular territory. But I think that's just a languaging thing. Um, I think that the post-tragic worldview is here for most everybody if they have the capacity for self-reflection and the capacity to explore what it means to be human. Some people that I've met that have the most powerful capacity for a post-tragic perspective, um, they're a deep devotee of some spiritual path or religion or something like that. And it may sound very, use developmental language. It might sound like 2.5 amber, um, sort of structure of consciousness, but they've gone so deep within their tradition that, they may look nothing like who would show up at Icon, for example. I'm not saying that someone that I'm describing couldn't show up at Icon, but it may not look like it, the sort of the main group of folks that are going to show up at a thing like that. But they have a post-tragic perspective. But it's because of their faith and their inner practice and connection to depth, that's getting them there. That's how they're able to, you know, to use religious language, they can lean on the Lord's grace, that puts some like thick soles, between their feet and the thorns of their life. And we see that all the time.
It reminds me of there's a sort of Sufi saying about 3 degrees of depth, different ways to language it, but there's something like, at first you're like, Lord, use me, but don't ruin me. And then you're like, all right, I got a little more faith, use me, and I don't care if you ruin me. And then you get a little more faith, and you're like, Lord, ruin me,
That's right.
which is
Exactly.
great. And it's really evocative, but it also gets dangerously close to um, devastating, nihilistic, self-sabotaging forms of religion. Like if I'm willing to be ruined by God, ruined by my faith, and if this world is ultimately doomed, why wouldn't I kill a bunch of strangers with a bomb or something like that, undertake a genocide? So what's the threshold there between those two things?
Well, I think what you described there is then we spiral off into shadow, which is another expression of separation. It's different than I have there are things that are going to occur in my life that are outside of my control, and I can interpret that those things are uh, polishing my sense of separation all the way down until I am only that gesture. So I think in its healthy form, what you're describing is, ruin me. It means uh, whittle me down until there's nothing left of me. There's only you. And now I am engaging on your behalf. The your, certainly we can conceive of it as a concrete God, but we can also interpret this as this single gesture of love. That when people have their ego, sort of their sense of I, whittled away, the natural impulse then becomes enlightened activity. It becomes a kind of uh, loving expression. So I think that's the gift in what you were describing. But then if we get too, what's the word? Like scar tissue, when we fall too far into the, just hurt me, we're now speaking in the voice of separation. Because that big, that divine loving existence, it's not about hurting. It's about going through a process where we awaken to the fact that we were never separate. And when that happens, we welcome the darkness, but we also welcome the light. There's a kind of an equanimity towards any expression of the whole. Yeah,
Yeah, I think there's some interesting ways to get stuck in or regress to the tragic from the post-tragic.
yeah,
Right. And when I look at people who are what we might broadly describe as the folk, the faithful, the traditional kind of person, it's easy to read a lot of pre-tragic in there, right? And there's just a nice old granny makes you cookies and she doesn't want to hear any bad things. So you got to respect that. But then there's this sort of sense that maybe the world really is horrible, right? And that's what the Bible or the Quran means, is that this world is terrible and it's doomed and the doom is coming. And really, you can do anything because it's awful underneath, right? And there's this but they continue to go to church, they continue to preach, they continue to hold a standard, but actually they've moved into the tragic and can't admit it. But sort of subconsciously and in the back rooms, they're all about the tragic. But because they can't quite reconcile that, it seems they can't move to the post tragic. So there's a split between their pre tragic sentiments and incentives and their tragic awareness that keeps them from really moving into the post tragic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is where I think there's a, when the pain gets big enough that it brings us to our knees, whether we say in prayer or in meditation or whatever you say and whatever traditions are out there, there's a way in which there's that small self has to go into the bow. And when we do that with sincerity, I think that can begin to invite, I think you used the word grace. It's the crying out that if we're lucky, we become a vessel that can hear. Sometimes we're crying out too loudly. We can't hear the rain because it's so subtle. But where we cry out, and then in that listening, there's something that starts to burn up some of those burdens. And then there becomes a relationship between the one who's crying out and what's descending as grace until there's enough of a transmutation that there's a recognition that the one who's crying out is actually the same as the one who's giving the grace. But I think in what you're describing, there needs to be that uh, crying out. It's that second person, that second face of God kind of dynamic, that asking for help from something beyond us that can help transition into that greater depth experience and start to cultivate that post tragic experience.
I've always liked to draw. I like the precision of black on white. I can only think of two examples when I ever really painted. One time was I went to a painting class when I was a little kid, and I remember because I'd had a dream about this shattered vase, so I tried to paint it where like it still has the vase shape, but the fragments of the vase that make the shape aren't fully connected. They're just sort of hovering in a broken, and then the flower stem was square interlocking chains. So that was the first thing I ever tried to paint. And then maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I did a public painting competition. I thought, well, I don't have any skills in this regard, but it might be worth a try. And it ended up being kind of weird, very vivid colors with a sort of mm, like Raymond Lulley's attempt to draw a four-dimensional cube. I was trying to paint like weird higher spatial geometries. It was a lot of fun, but I feel completely incompetent when it comes to painting. What are your personal experiences of being a painter, if any?
I don't have many experiences of being a painter. Uh, yeah, it's not a skill that I've practiced. Um, my inclination is to paint with words. So that's the place where I feel I've tried to express creativity through music and writing. But it's specifically the writing that feels more to me like painting with words, painting with images, trying to invite people into a direct experience of really what we're talking about and into the intimacy and beauty and sacredness within pain. Um, so I've leaned on that territory. I'm sort of at the uh, two-dimensional uh, stick figure squiggles level. I think at some point I could enjoy um, playing with color, but as long as it didn't require that I knew how to paint with any dimensionality. Um, Otherwise, I mean, I'd have to learn those skills, but without those skills, it would be more like a Jackson Pollock kind of, yeah.
Um, it's something I want to put on the table in the post-tragic discussion because it's something I've attended to a lot. We mentioned Nietzsche earlier. And when I think of the post-tragic, I think it's pretty much what Nietzsche just called the tragic.
Hmm.
He was very excited about tragic philosophy as an alternative to either naive optimism or depressive pessimism. And in his first book, he's looking back at this really fertile period of Hellenic culture, right? The age that precedes Socrates and the golden age of Athens. He's looking at this period that kind of created all that, but it didn't just create this cultural outburst in Greece. It created our notions of drama and comedy and musical octaves and architecture and the sciences and the philosophies that we've used for several thousand years. So there was a very fertile cultural field in this historical niche. And he's asking himself, looking at the emergence of modernity and postmodernity, why was that? How can we get that regenerativity back culturally? And he says, was it because they had an inspiring shared narrative that gave them an optimistic alternative to upsetting ecological and political events? Well, no. When you look at their art and entertainment and poetry, it was all very bleak. It's like they were all watching Breaking Bad all the time. In every one of those great Hellenic tales, the protagonist goes insane or gets destroyed or dooms himself trying to escape his doom. And Nietzsche talks about this like quintessential story of a king trying to capture the satyr Silenus, who was one of the hangers on of the god Dionysus. So the king traps this supernatural creature, and he calls his advisor and he says, all right, we've got this entity, what should we ask it? And the advisor says, all right, ask it what the best thing in life is. And they ask him and he says, the best thing is never to have been born. So this messes with them. And he goes to his advisor. Okay, what else should we ask him? And the guy goes, ask him what the second best thing is. And they think they're very clever. They go to the satyr and they ask him the second best thing in life. And he says, to die young. But the Greeks loved these stories. They were always relishing them and telling them to each other. So there's this sense that Nietzsche was inspecting that the exposure to the inescapable and the dark and the tragic and the doomed was something that they took some pleasure in, which allowed them to feel all the tragic emotions, and that this was essential to their kind of radical cultural energy, right? And so I think he's saying, like, if we're depressed and pessimistic about the signs of the future or optimistic and think it might work, both of those are kind of fragile. Whereas the times maybe when culture has really been able to grapple with its moment and generate enduring forms has been when it's taken a pleasure and an intentional willingness to just expose themselves to the boundaries of the world and go as deep as that makes them feel.
Right. A lot of times when I'm working with folks, there seems to be not in everybody, but often there's an underlying implicit assumption that if I'm a human being and things don't feel good, something's terribly wrong. And so the idea is, well, if I do the right thing, I won't feel bad, and then that'll be the point of being human. And I think that what you're pointing to here is flipping that upside down and brings us into more of a post-tragic worldview, which is maybe the point isn't to have everything be fine here. It doesn't seem like fine here has ever really been the central feature of the last, 14 billion years. Fine here might not be what we're up to. And so while we can name the meta crisis and we can come up with ways to describe what it is and why it is and what are we doing here and what should we do about it, and while we might give everything we can to help people suffer less, I think the post-tragic invitation includes that maybe the result isn't necessarily that then everything is okay. And if we can take that either out of the picture or just soften, have it be a little more pastel over in the corner a little bit, it opens up a different way of orienting to what's my purpose and how will I know if I'm fulfilling it? And will I know that I'm fulfilling it? it does my ability to fulfill it mean that all of a sudden everything is going to look good? And sometimes what I see in a lot of folks that listen to things like this and are interested in helping people is that that hopelessness can arise from, well, I've done all of these things and I've created all of these maps and I've had all of these conversations and I've worked with all of these clients, and yet things still seem bad. It's like, well, maybe they're being that diminished chord, which is a chord in music that is dissonant. Maybe that's part of what we're doing here. We're learning how to find the intrinsic beauty and meaning in that, and that it's our grappling with it that awakens something that's a part of our evolution.
It reminds me of my interest in remorse as a self-transformative approach and practice. And one of the things I found in looking to remorse as a kind of developmental yoga is that a lot of people who come out of a 20th century background are a little bit hesitant because they feel like they were working to escape this inherited notion that we are sinful and guilty beings and that someone else was trying to put this on them to tell them that life is insufficient, that we fail and sabotage ourselves and are doomed, and that we've got to let that kind of thinking go and turn to an embrace of the sheer voluntary positivity that's available to us. There's something very beautiful about that, but maybe also something fragile. And I feel like when I bring the post tragic back around to the blues, what I see there is a truly beautiful way of experiencing the world as in one of its dimensions, fallen and sinful,
Yeah.
but not therefore outside of redemption.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's an embrace of the pain as the foundation for emergence. And my sense is that that's, we have an externally imposed sense of you should be remorseful because you are a sinner. That's coming from an earlier territory. But then as we grow up and grow deep, I think our principles come from somewhere else. They don't come from a externally imposed rule order, but rather they come from an internal sort of context capable inner set of principles that can handle a kind of adaptive, context oriented set of what's right and what's wrong. That allows for a degree of messiness because sometimes something seems right or seems wrong, but there's like 15 contexts that we're interacting with, and it gets a little more, it gets more subtle. But then there's also the ability to, it's not just sin is wrong, so repress it, which is something that some earlier stages are really good at doing. But now we have to unrepress it, but then assimilate it from a deeper loving presence so that it's still, so that it doesn't cause harm, but it's no longer in a place of repression.
To me, this seems like a very natural way of thinking to people with a therapeutic background of some kind, right? I've never really identified with being a healer, but I've been associated with integrative and holistic communities and psychotherapy and all this kind of thing. And there's a lot of talk, you know, in psychological therapy about accepting and grieving in order to move on. There's a lot of, the principle of Rolfing about, I'm going to feel, don't push the stars, be the sky. There's a kind of, you have to enfold and accept and meet the limitation in your experience in order to undergo a transformative and healing process. And this is a fairly well known kind of meta principle in a lot of therapeutic and healing domains, not always in sociopolitical and philosophical domains. Do you think that your uh, attentiveness to and receptivity to the post tragic principle is informed by your own background in therapeutic principles?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Um, well, it's informed by a couple of things. It's informed by what you're describing, where, meeting therapists and meeting traditions that say, okay, you have to turn towards your pain. You know, that's certainly it's how the post-tragic perspective initially started to emerge when I'm able to embody it. It was informed. It was informed by leaning into and making contact with pain that was shepherded along by these traditions that you describe. Um, but then also for me, meditation. And you know, I sort of follow two different pathways in meditation, and you know, we see in territories in Buddhism, there's certainly stories of practitioners who intentionally go into the difficult places as a way to deepen their awakening experiences. We see in Buddhism the recognition of everything is sacred, everything is a teacher, everything is a teaching. We have that. And then the other tradition that's lesser known, but it's called Surat Shabad Yoga. There's more of a second person perspective invitation to coming into contact with the deep creative forces of existence that um, burn up our pain, but at the same time that it's burning up our pain, we're having to feel it because it's there. It's there. So for me, the spiritual traditions as well as the therapeutic traditions have um, helped me a lot. I think I've found parts work and shadow work to be some of the best um, modalities because if we're working with parts, for a part to find transformation, it typically needs to be in contact with wholeness, even if it's just a sliver of curiosity, care, love. And so, in order for that process to happen, someone has to have access to wholeness, whether it's the practitioner, which is less ideal, or the client themselves, which is more ideal. Um, So for me, that's been like the a big teaching ground. And then the spiritual traditions have sort of supported that through a kind of sort of deeper orientation to that one gesture.
Sometimes I'll say that there's two things human beings aren't very good at: feeling good and feeling bad. Uh, because to be truly joyous and ecstatic, to be uncontracted, to let your heart go all the way, that's something we don't really practice. But at the same time, we're not very good at suffering. We suffer a lot, but we're not very good at it. We don't really know how to feel bad in a way that helps us, helps others, moves us through processes, gives us something on the other side of the process. And I feel like for me, one of the things the post tragic sensibility points to is a convergence of getting better at feeling good and feeling bad.
Yeah, and uh, often feeling good and feeling bad at the same time. And that's one of the sort of the central things that I see is a necessary skill that so far we've underdeveloped, whether we're looking at advanced stages or early stages, just human beings in general. There's often a sense of, well, I feel good-ish, and now I feel bad-ish, or I feel terrible, and then I feel ecstatic. And there's a kind of a flopping back and forth. And to me, the one aspect of the post-tragic worldview actually arises out of bringing those together at the same time. How can I feel how can I feel the deep saturation of an unbroken love while also feeling currents of screaming agony and torment? Can I do that at the same time? And if I can, then it allows me to start to see that everything is everything, not conceptually, but a way in which the torment that is still in torment starts to discover itself as that love. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a moral critique of certain kinds of spiritual states as being insensitive to the true horror of being, right? This idea, like if you were to just stand far enough back and see the whole picture of God's plan, you would see how this Holocaust fits in there. And that does a disservice to the intolerability of every Holocaust.
That's right.
But I think what we're talking about is not seeing that the negative thing was just secretly a positive thing all along. What we're talking about is that in its negativity, even in its intolerableness, the quality of it being itself, being that intolerable thing, is part of what's glorious about being. Doesn't mean it isn't absolutely emotionally intolerable and has to be fought. It's perfect because it is that.
That's right. And again, it's a direct experience. I mean, I've experienced a lot of, I mean, my dad was murdered, like that's a tough thing to carry. And I'm not, I mean, plenty of people have had way worse. I mean, I've had a privileged life. So there's also that aspect of it. But what you're describing has to come through actually feeling the torment and feeling the aliveness in it. The When I step back and see everything as a part of God's plan, I'm extracting myself from feeling. I'm sort of putting a cognitive structure that sort of makes sense and everything seems neat and tidy, rather than what you were describing before, where you're feeling the texture of it. Now, in practice, if I'm in contact with someone who has gone through something like the Holocaust, there's no place in my being that is like, oh, what's happening for you is for the best and it's deeply sacred and meaningful. That's a bunch of bullshit. What comes naturally from a post-tragic perspective is a deep, loving embrace, weeping with them. But the heart doesn't lose heart. There's a deep recognition that this is the divine with its broken knees, feeling the horror of being human. There's no thought about it. There's only loving deeply and embracing, what can I do? How can I be with you? Rather than like, oh, this is so meaningful, isn't it? You and your like Holocaust experience. Geez, like God's plan sure is strange. It's not like that at all. There's just love and embrace and tears.
You ever painted a house?
Indeed. Yes, indeed. I was sure, then I was
Yeah.
hesitant, then I became sure.
First of all, what color? And second of all, what do you remember about that experience?
Um, what color? Now, I have to say, I have a very unusual relationship to colors, and I don't always get the names right. I believe it would be like a gray. Well, I would call it purple, but people would say it's gray, but within the realm of purplishness.
Okay.
Um, and so that experience, it was a lot of fun. It was our old house that where our daughter was born, and we painted it because we didn't have the money to hire somebody to paint it. So we thought, well, we'll just do it, and it was a lot more work than we thought, but we did it. Uh, yeah, it was a joyous experience.
Yeah, there's something beautiful about it. I volunteered at this thrift store for a couple of years, and there was this old lady would come in, and one day she just asked me out of the blue to paint her house. And, I helped my dad do house painting sometimes. So I thought, oh, I can do this. And what really stood out to me was the sort of subliminal effect of the intensity of the concentration. I used to get this playing Tetris sometimes too, but you're just brushing little things, and then later you close your eyes, you're trying to go to sleep, and you can see in vivid detail every little thing because you've been looking at it so hard for hours.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's something
I,
delightful about deeply saturated, wet color that I find
yes,
compelling.
I just the word saturated is really hot. Ken Wilber has this distinction he makes between authentic and legitimate, right? And authentic is sort of like how much what you're saying speaks to your own situation and structure, and legitimate is how much it's validated by others, by society, by institutions, things like that. To me, there's something about the prose tragic that both is authentic and legitimate. It's legitimate in the sense that it acknowledges how poorly many things are going,
Yeah.
right? It's not Pollyannish at all. You can say to people, you're like, yeah, look, we get it. And we have to, as a community, as a philosophy, as individuals in the world, be able to say, yeah, that's going really bad. That is absolutely the wrong direction. And people are suffering. It has to be, we have to legitimate ourselves by not pretending it's working out. But there's something authentic about it too, which is sometimes I'll talk to people who are a little bit younger than me and they're worried about how we're going to help with this and how we're going to solve the meta crisis. And you want to just say to them, look, we're all going to die. The project is going to fail. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But like that's just sort of a confession of being a living being in a finite world where, as much as you succeed in really interesting ways, there are fundamental limits and regressions and failures and a terminal marker on that. And it seems like that sends a signal, that authenticity. It's a signal I want to be able to send to people who are working on existential transformation and healing and new thought and philosophy, of saying, look, it we want to embrace all this from a humanly real position with the
Yeah.
maturity of going, we can only do what we're going to do, and we're not doing it because it's definitely going to work. We're doing it because we have to do it in a world where it may or may not work, and in which, to some degree, in one dimension, we're doomed anyway.
Yeah, what comes up for me as you're speaking is the season of autumn. The season of autumn begins with fruition. It begins with a kind of maturation. There's something that, given all of the unfolding over the year, there's a final sweet shape that's the product of our engagement. But then after that comes a withering, comes a decay, comes a dissolution, comes the death that you're speaking about in terms of its inevitability. But the thing is that those fruits have seeds, and those seeds fall forward. Then they come into a place of dormancy during winter. And then in the spring, those seeds, they remember their history. And they have the chance that we're not just going around in a circle, but there's those seeds that come post post death, post dissolution, um, they carry the memory of what's come before. And I think this is the beauty of process philosophy, the recognition that we're an unfolding process, that we inherit a living history. And so that as we're doing our best to do whatever our heart is sort of compelling us to do, that that becomes a fruit that then becomes a seed that yes, we're going to die. But every choice we make to bring forward the sort of expressions of this deeper wholeness, every effort we make to be a jerk, those things are going to become the seeds that pass forward, and someone else is going to carry that torch. So the way that we love our children, the way that we love our friends, the way that we respond to our neighbors, people are going to walk away with the fruits of those moments, and they're going to carry them long beyond us. And so, there's a way in which we can see that this process is vast. So maybe it can lead to a sense of insignificance. On the other hand, we have the option to plant these fantastic seeds of possibility that really change people, even in the smallest of interactions. We don't need the biggest map to make the biggest change. I think we just need to learn how to love each other when we disagree. That becomes a seed for how the world's going to unfold for the next 14 billion years.
I feel like there's a way of participating in that forward movement of seeds that's related to, you know, maybe feeling insignificant,
Yeah.
sort of letting all the potentially negative feelings drop through oneself.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this great series that Bruce and I did with John Vervaeke called Grieving the Death of God, right? And Nietzsche came up there a lot because Nietzsche has this famous, a lot of people attribute God is dead to him, but the actual section is he's accusing the atheists of not processing what they've done, right?
Yeah.
He's saying like, yes, we've killed him, but like, how was that possible? And you haven't even begun to smell the decomposition of the corpse, he tells them, right? So there's this, yeah, it may have happened, but you can't just jump, be like, well, we're done with that. There's a whole thing you're going to have to go through. There's a descent of the energy and the emotion. It's not just an upward escape. You're not going to be able to get through this in a way that participates in the ongoing vitality and improvement of the world unless you allow your feelings to go down as far as they need to go.
Exactly. Exactly. Fully touching the sacred textures of self-reflective experience. I mean, it seems like the human realm that's emerging from the life realm, that's emerging from the realm of matter, at least from what we can see in our way of orienting. One of the central things that we are doing is exploring this sense of separation. It gives us self-reflection and it gives us the recognition of our agony. It creates a gap. And in that gap, all sorts of stuff happens from suffering to asking, who am I? And so my sense is that, by getting as close as we can to those textures of experience, we're filling out that human world, exploring the contours and the possibilities within this conscious gap between what's happening and our ability to shine a light on it. It seems like that's what we're up to. That means that part of what we're up to is suffering and trying to find ways to suffer less and then suffer again and continue in that wave of um, the diminished chords, the chords of dissonance, and then the arrival back home to that deeper sense of nature, whether it's our physiological nature of just feeling safe for a moment, or it's the deepest awakening to the deepest nature that we can find. That there's this in breath and out breath within the realm of duality where we walk away from home and it's raining and there's razor blades and we hate it. And then we walk back towards home, but then walking back towards home changes our view of when we walked away. And we keep doing that in this spiralic fashion. It seems like that's what we're up to in some ways.
Spiralic. um, well, we're at the end now. Is there any last thing you'd like to say about the art of painting?
Well, my sense is that in the art of painting, a possibility is that we drop into the deep textures that we have available to us and um, we find the places that feel horrible and we try to show the world the beauty in it so that everyone starts looking, they can't turn away. And to me, good art, not all good art, but a certain aspect of good art, it's so compelling that we have to look at the grotesque because it's shown, its beauty is shown. We see the wetness of we see that it's made from this quality of being that's hard to grasp, and yet somehow it's there and it's compelling. And so then we look at what we wouldn't normally look at, and we see that there's a sacred world, even when there's incredible tragedy.
Hmm. Thanks for doing this conversation with me. I think a lot of people are starting to respond to the concept of the post-tragic, but there hasn't really been much nuanced beginnings of exploration of what all's in there. And it's always a joy to see you, and it does my heart good to be in this shared sensibility with you.
Yeah, I love being here with you too. And, I hope for the listeners that this is an invitation into a shared conversation, that what we're describing here is not um, like what the post-tragic worldview is, but it's playing in a territory. It's asking a question and then playing with the question that I hope everyone who's interested in this kind of stuff would start playing with this kind of question. So yeah, thank you so much. So glad to be here with you and everybody.